Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a vast, dark forest. It's not a forest made of trees, but of your deepest fears, anxieties, and the shadows within your own mind. You can feel the weight of it pressing on your chest, the air thick with uncertainty. And then, a voice whispers, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown." That's Carl Jung speaking to you, inviting you into the heart of a psychological transformation that only 1% of people will ever fully embrace. But here's the twist. This isn't just a video, it's an experiment. Together, we're going to dive into one of the most profound psychological tricks Carl Jung ever uncovered, a method so powerful that, if you truly understand it, it can reshape how you experience anxiety forever. Let me ask you something. How often do you find yourself running from your own thoughts, trying to fix, suppress, or escape them? What if I told you that the key isn't to outrun them, but to turn around and face them head on? To walk into that forest and let it swallow you whole, because that's where the real transformation begins. We're going to take this one step at a time, but before we do, let me tell you why this works. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Think about that for a second. What he's saying is that most of our lives are controlled by the parts of ourselves we refuse to look at. Anxiety isn't just a random feeling, it's a signal, a messenger from the unconscious mind. And what's the first thing most of us do when we feel it? We try to get rid of it. But here's the truth. Anxiety doesn't go away because it's not meant to. It's there to show you something. Let me share an experiment with you. Picture this. A group of participants is hooked up to monitors that measure their heart rate, sweat levels, and breathing. They're told they'll be shocked with a mild electric current at random intervals. The twist: half of them are given a button they can press to stop the shocks, while the other half has no control at all. Guess which group experiences more anxiety? It's not the one without the button, it's the group with it. Why? Because the illusion of control over their anxiety makes them hyper-focused on it. The harder they try to control it, the more it controls them. Click subscribe to this channel to get more insights into human psychology. This is where Jung's trick comes in. He believed that anxiety isn't something to fight or control, but something to integrate. What you resist persists, he wrote. And this is the golden rule we're going to explore together. The next time you feel anxiety creeping in, I want you to try something radical. Instead of pushing it away, lean into it. Ask yourself, what is this trying to tell me? What part of myself have I been ignoring? Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming whole by embracing the parts of ourselves we've rejected. Let me explain this with a story. There was a man who came to Jung paralyzed by anxiety. He felt like he was being crushed by invisible forces, unable to sleep, eat, or even think clearly. Jung didn't give him a prescription or a quick fix. Instead, he asked him to describe his dreams. In one of them, the man was standing on the edge of a cliff with a massive, terrifying shadow behind him. He was frozen, unable to jump or turn around. Jung told him, "That shadow is your anxiety. It's everything you've buried, your fears, your desires, your guilt. But it's not your enemy, it's your guide. The only way forward is to face it." Over time, the man began to engage with his shadow, exploring the parts of himself he'd denied. Slowly, his anxiety began to dissolve, not because it disappeared, but because he outgrew it. Now, I know what you're thinking. This all sounds abstract, right? So let's make it practical. Here's an exercise you can try right now. Close your eyes and bring to mind something that makes you anxious. It could be a deadline, a relationship, or even just a vague sense of dread. Instead of trying to fix it, I want you to imagine it as a physical form. What does it look like? Is it a heavy weight on your chest? A dark cloud? A shadowy figure? Once you have that image, ask it, "What are you here to teach me?" Don't judge the answer, just listen. Jung believed that anxiety is like a dream. Symbolic, not literal. It speaks in images and feelings, not words. The more you engage with it, the more you'll understand what it's really about. This brings us to one of Jung's most profound insights. In all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. Anxiety feels chaotic because it's pointing to something we haven't yet understood. It's like a puzzle piece that doesn't fit because we're looking at it the wrong way. But when you shift your perspective, when you stop seeing anxiety as a problem and start seeing it as a guide, everything changes. Let me give you another example. There's a famous psychological experiment called the white bear experiment. Participants are told to sit in a room and think about anything they want except a white bear. The result? Almost everyone ends up obsessing over white bears. This is exactly how we deal with anxiety. The more we try to suppress it, the stronger it becomes. Jung's approach flips this on its head. He would say, don't avoid the bear. Invite it in. Sit with it. Ask why it's here. This might sound counterintuitive, even terrifying. But here's the thing. Once you stop running from your anxiety, it loses its power over you. Jung described this process as holding the tension of the opposites. It's about sitting with the discomfort, the fear, the uncertainty, without trying to resolve it immediately. And in that tension, something incredible happens. Your unconscious mind begins to reveal its secrets. Let's go deeper. Jung believed that every emotion we feel has a purpose, even the painful ones. There is no coming to consciousness without pain, he wrote. Anxiety is like a fire, it burns, but it also illuminates. It shows us where we're out of alignment, where we're clinging to old patterns or beliefs that no longer serve us. But to see that, you have to be willing to step into the fire. Let me give you one last exercise before we move on. The next time you feel anxious, try journaling about it. But don't just write about how it feels. Write as if your anxiety were a person. Give it a name, a personality, even a backstory. What would it say if it could talk? What does it want from you? This might sound strange, but it's a powerful way to externalize your feelings and see them from a new perspective. Jung called this active imagination, engaging with the unconscious mind through creativity and dialogue. At this point, you might be feeling a mix of curiosity and resistance. That's normal. Remember, only 1% of people will ever fully embrace this kind of work. It's not easy, but it's worth it. Because on the other side of this journey lies something extraordinary: freedom. Not freedom from anxiety, but freedom within it. The kind of freedom that comes from knowing that you can face anything, even the darkest parts of yourself, and come out stronger on the other side. Now that we've laid the foundation for understanding anxiety through Carl Jung's psychology, it's time to go even deeper into the process. This is where we'll explore the practical tools, psychological experiments, and the profound wisdom Jung left behind for handling anxiety, not by fighting it, but by transforming it into a source of strength and growth. Take a moment to reflect on this. Why is it so hard for us to face our anxiety? Why do we instinctively avoid it, suppress it, or distract ourselves from it? Jung believed that the answer lies in what he called the shadow. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. What he meant is that the shadow represents the aspects of ourselves that we deny, repress, or avoid because they don't align with the image of who we think we should be. And here's the kicker. Anxiety often arises when these hidden parts of ourselves try to break through to the surface. Let's connect this to a famous psychological experiment. In the 1970s, a psychologist named Daniel Wegner conducted a study on thought suppression. He asked participants to sit in a room and try not to think about a white bear for 5 minutes. Unsurprisingly, the participants found it almost impossible. The more they tried to suppress the thought, the more it dominated their mind. This is called the rebound effect, and it's exactly what happens when we try to suppress our anxiety. The more you push it down, the more it pushes back. Jung would argue that the solution isn't to suppress the shadow but to integrate it. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, he wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. So, what does this mean for your anxiety? It means that the parts of yourself you're avoiding, your fears, your insecurities, your doubts, aren't your enemies. They're your teachers. And the more you resist them, the more power you give them. But if you turn toward them, if you bring them into the light of your awareness, they begin to lose their hold over you. Let me show you how this works with a practical exercise. I want you to think of a moment in your life when you felt overwhelmed by anxiety. Maybe it was a situation where you felt judged, rejected, or out of control. Now, instead of focusing on the external circumstances, ask yourself, what part of me was triggered at that moment? Was it a fear of failure? A feeling of not being good enough? A need for control? Jung believed that every emotional reaction is a clue to something deeper. When you follow that clue, you start to uncover the unconscious beliefs and patterns that are driving your anxiety. Here's another way to think about it. Imagine your anxiety as a character in a story. What would it look like? How would it act? Jung often used mythology and archetypes to help people understand their inner world. He believed that the unconscious mind communicates through symbols, and that by giving your anxiety a symbolic form, you can begin to engage with it in a new way. For example, if your anxiety feels like a looming shadow, what happens if you turn around and face it? What does it say? What does it want? This process, called active imagination, is one of Jung's most powerful tools for integrating the unconscious. Now, let's take this further with a psychological experiment you can try at home. The next time you feel anxious, set a timer for 5 minutes and do nothing but sit with the feeling. Don't try to fix it, analyze it, or push it away. Just observe it where it shows up in your body, how it moves, what thoughts accompany it. This might feel uncomfortable at first, but that's the point. Jung would call this holding the tension of the opposites. It's about creating a space where opposing forces, your desire to feel safe and your fear of the unknown, can coexist. And in that space, something incredible happens. Your anxiety begins to transform. Let's pause for a moment and reflect on this idea. Jung believed that anxiety is a signal that something within us is out of alignment. It's not a problem to be solved, but a message to be understood. The privilege of a lifetime, he wrote, is to become who you truly are, but to do that, you have to be willing to face the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. And this isn't just a mental exercise, it's a deeply emotional and spiritual journey. To illustrate this, let me share a story about a woman who came to Jung for therapy. She was plagued by anxiety and recurring nightmares of being chased by a wild animal. No matter how fast she ran, the animal was always right behind her. Jung asked her to imagine what would happen if she stopped running. In her mind, she turned around to face the animal, and to her surprise, it didn't attack her. Instead, it transformed into a beautiful, luminous figure that handed her a gift. Jung explained that the animal represented her shadow, her repressed fears and desires, and that by facing it, she was able to reclaim a part of herself she had lost. This brings us to one of Jung's most transformative insights. The thing that irritates us most in others is often something we have denied in ourselves. Anxiety often arises in relationships when we project our shadow onto others. For example, if you're constantly worrying about being judged or rejected, it might be because you've rejected a part of yourself. Jung called this process projection, and it's one of the most common ways the unconscious mind tries to get our attention. So, how do you stop projecting and start integrating? Here's an exercise you can try. The next time someone triggers your anxiety, whether it's a boss, a partner, or even a stranger, ask yourself, what am I projecting onto them? What qualities do they have that I'm uncomfortable with in myself? This isn't about blaming yourself or excusing their behavior, it's about taking responsibility for your own inner world. Jung believed that the more you integrate your shadow, the less power it has to control you. Let's circle back to the idea of individuation, the process of becoming whole. Jung believed that this is the ultimate goal of life, and that anxiety is one of the most powerful catalysts for this journey. Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart, he wrote. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens. Anxiety forces us to look inside, to confront the parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. And while this can be painful, it's also profoundly liberating. Before we move on, let me leave you with one final exercise. Think about a time in your life when you overcame something you thought you couldn't handle. Maybe it was a breakup, a job loss, or a difficult conversation. At the time, it might have felt overwhelming, but looking back, you can see how it helped you grow. Now, apply that same perspective to your current anxiety. What if this feeling isn't here to hurt you but to help you? What if it's guiding you toward a deeper understanding of yourself? This is the heart of Jung psychology. The idea that every challenge, every fear, and every shadow contains the seed of transformation. But that transformation can only happen if you're willing to face it. Now that we've uncovered the roots of anxiety and explored the concept of the shadow, it's time to focus on the final and most transformative part of this journey: how to truly integrate these lessons into your life. Many people get stuck in the process of understanding their anxiety intellectually, but transformation only happens when you embody these insights. Carl Jung believed that the key to lasting change lies not in avoiding or analyzing your anxiety endlessly, but in actively engaging with it as a force that can lead to wholeness. So, let's dive deeper into the practical, emotional, and spiritual tools that can help you apply his wisdom. First, let's revisit one of Jung's most famous ideas. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. What does this mean in the context of anxiety? It means that if you don't address the root of your anxiety within yourself, it will manifest in your eternal life through repeated patterns, difficult relationships, or situations that seem to trap you. Think about your own life. Have you ever noticed how certain problems keep coming back, no matter how hard you try to avoid them? That's not a coincidence. Jung would say that these recurring issues are symbols of an internal conflict that's asking to be resolved. Let's make this practical with a simple but powerful exercise. Take out a piece of paper and divide it into two columns. In the left column, write down the situations in your life that trigger the most anxiety. Be specific, name the people, places, or events that consistently make you feel uneasy or overwhelmed. In the right column, write down what these situations might be reflecting about your inner world. For example, if you feel anxious about public speaking, it might reflect a fear of being judged. If you feel anxious in relationships, it might point to a fear of vulnerability or rejection. This exercise isn't about blaming yourself, it's about recognizing the patterns that your anxiety is trying to show you. You might be wondering, what do I do with this information once I've identified the patterns? This is where Jung's concept of active imagination comes into play. Active imagination is a technique for engaging directly with the unconscious mind. Here's how it works. Find a quiet place where you won't be disturbed. Close your eyes and bring to mind one of the situations or patterns you wrote down. Imagine it as vividly as you can. What does it look like, feel like, sound like? Now, let the image evolve. Maybe it takes the form of a person, an animal, or a symbol. Ask it questions. Why are you here? What do you want me to know? Don't try to control the answers, just let them come. This process might feel strange at first, but it's one of the most effective ways to communicate with the unconscious mind. Let me share a real-life example to illustrate how this works. Jung once worked with a man who was plagued by crippling anxiety and recurring dreams of being lost in a maze. Through active imagination, the man visualized himself walking through the maze and eventually encountering a figure at its center, a wise old man who handed him a key. Jung interpreted this as a symbol of the man's inner guide, or what he called the self, the central archetype of wholeness. By engaging with this image, the man was able to access a deeper part of himself and begin to navigate his anxiety with more clarity and confidence. This brings us to one of Jung's most profound insights about anxiety. It often arises when we resist the process of transformation. There is no birth of consciousness without pain, he said. Anxiety is a sign that something within you is trying to change, but your ego, the part of you that wants to stay in control, is resisting that change. Think of it like a snake shedding its skin. The process is uncomfortable, even painful, but it's necessary for growth. The question is, are you willing to let go of the old version of yourself to make room for something new? Let's explore this idea further with another exercise. Imagine your anxiety as a doorway. On one side of the door is your current self, the part of you that feels safe in the familiar, but also trapped by fear and doubt. On the other side is your future self, the person you could become if you fully embraced your anxiety as a guide. What does that future self look like? What qualities do they have? How do they handle challenges? Write down everything that comes to mind. Now, ask yourself, what's stopping me from walking through that door? What am I afraid of losing? This exercise can help you identify the specific fears and attachments that are keeping you stuck. At this point, you might be wondering, how do I know if I'm making progress? Jung believed that one of the signs of psychological growth is a shift in your relationship with anxiety. Instead of seeing it as something to be feared, you begin to see it as a source of insight and energy. The shadow, he wrote, is a tight passage, a narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared, who goes down to the deep well. The deeper you go into your anxiety, the more you'll discover about yourself. And the more you discover about yourself, the less power your anxiety will have over you. Let me share another story to illustrate this. Jung once worked with a woman who was consumed by anxiety about her career. She felt like she was constantly falling short, no matter how hard she worked. Through therapy, Jung helped her see that her anxiety wasn't really about her job, it was about her fear of failure and her need for external validation. Once she recognized this, she was able to shift her focus from trying to prove herself to others to pursuing work that genuinely fulfilled her. Her anxiety didn't disappear overnight, but it became a guide rather than a burden, a signal that helped her stay aligned with her true self. This idea that anxiety can be a guide is central to Jung's psychology, but it requires a willingness to embrace uncertainty and discomfort. The greatest tragedy of the family, Jung said, is the unlived lives of the parents. What he meant is that when we avoid facing our own fears and desires, we pass them on to others, whether it's our children, our partners, or our friends. By confronting your anxiety, you're not just transforming your own life, you're breaking a cycle that affects everyone around you. Before we wrap up, let's talk about one final tool for integrating anxiety: ritual. Jung believed that rituals, whether they're personal or cultural, are a way of connecting with the unconscious mind. You don't have to follow a specific tradition to create a ritual. It can be as simple as lighting a candle, journaling, or meditating. The key is to create a space where you can reflect on your inner world and honor the process of transformation. For example, you might create a ritual around the doorway exercise we discussed earlier. Each time you imagine yourself walking through the door, light a candle or say a mantra like, "I embrace the unknown." Over time, this will help you build a stronger connection with your future self. As we come to the end of this journey, I want to leave you with one final quote from Jung. We cannot change anything until we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses. Anxiety is not your enemy. It's a part of you that's asking to be seen, heard, and understood. The more you accept it, the more it will transform into something that empowers you rather than limits you. This is the ultimate trick that only 1% of people use. They don't try to overcome anxiety by fighting it. They overcome it by facing it, learning from it, and integrating it. This is the path to wholeness, and it's available to you if you're willing to take the first step. So, are you ready to step into that forest and meet the shadow waiting for you? The choice is yours.